but they won't hear until 7 o'clock.
All right, everybody.
They can hear.
Uhuru brothers and sisters, my name is Omali Yeshitela, and I'm the chairman of the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. This webinar is sponsored by the Black is Back Coalition in an effort to cut through the lies of the U.S. government, the State of Israel, and the bourgeois white nationalist media that represent the system of slavery and murder that is killing Palestinian people in plain sight of the world. Sister Nellie and Brother Glen joined me in this webinar, both of whom are dedicated anti-imperialist militants and outspoken advocates for black self-determination. Comrades Nellie and Glen are also founding members of the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. In addition to the work both of these comrades do with the Black is Back Coalition and in the trenches of resistance to white power, they are also contributors to Black Agenda Report and radio. The Black is Back Coalition is not an innocent bystander in the massacre that is occurring in occupied Palestine. From our inception, the question of Palestine has been front and center. Among the founding demands of our coalition are these very important points. One, we demand an immediate end to U.S. support for the illegitimate white settler colonial government of Israel. Two, we demand recognition of all rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to an independent, sovereign Palestinian state and the right to return for all Palestinian refugees. In addition, the Black is Back Coalition has been working with a national black political agenda for self-determination for the last 2 years. It is a national black political agenda that was accomplished through a very democratic process that included state conventions in 10 different states and in the District of Columbia, and a national conference in Washington, D.C. Point 18 of the National Black Political Agenda reads, Free Palestine, down with Israel apartheid. We demand recognition of all rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to an independent, sovereign Palestinian state and the right to return for all Palestinian refugees. The U.S. must immediately end all monetary aid, trade relationships, and military cooperation with the apartheid Zionist state of Israel until that uniquely barbaric affront to human civilization is dismantled and abolished. Earlier this week, U.S. President Donald J. Trump kept to his campaign promise to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. I want to say that although a lot of people are talking about Trump's doing this, the first we heard in recent memory of a U.S. presidential candidate promising to do that, going beyond what most candidates had ever done before, was from Barack Hussein Obama. And so I want to say this for those people, those liberals who want to be upset with Trump, making the assumption that this is a Trump thing and not something that the U.S. government, the U.S. imperialism has had intentions around for some time now, and there's a reason for that. This action, in the face of criticism from the Palestinian people and from even some white countries allied with the United States, in most of its colonial crimes around the world. Since the announcement and actual ceremony establishing the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, the Palestinian people, faced with this final blow to their national dignity and any pretext of peaceful intentions by the U.S. government, came out in the thousands to protest. The Israeli state unleashed a brutal attack, killing at least 60 unarmed Palestinian people and wounding more than 1,000. Sister Nellie, Bailey, Brother Glen, what in the hell is going on? What is the history of this situation? The Israelis claim that the land they occupy was given to them by God some 2,000 years or more ago. Some Africans are also familiar with the biblical promised land for the children of Israel. Others justify the vicious repression of the Palestinian people by the recent history of European Jews that resulted in concentration camps and the invention of the word genocide. Can we wade through any of this and get to the essential questions roiling the situation in occupied Palestine, the Middle East, and Northern Africa today that is reflected in the slaughter of the Palestinians and the Trump move of the U.S. Embassy? So I would really like to hear from you, Brother Glen, Sister Nellie. Let's cut through this. Let's talk about what's really going on. And I think it's important for people to know some things about the history of this Israeli entity. Because the narrative that we are being fed every day presupposes Israel, the shining city on the hill, the only democracy, as they like to put it, in the Middle East. What do you say, Sister Nellie?
Well, this week we also celebrated the 70th anniversary of Nakba. That is the expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians from their homes. That was in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. And so the date and timing was to add insult to injury to the Palestinian people and their protests, not only for the removal of the embassy to Jerusalem, but also in celebration, rather in commemoration of Nakba. And that was their Holocaust, that was their catastrophe. So the Trump administration and its Zionist neocons who are in the driver's seat in his administration knew exactly what they were doing when they chose this date.
So, Glen, what would you add to that, if anything?
Well, you know, many of us believe that when Trump finally made that move that so many presidents have said that they would like to make but didn't, he actually did the world a favor because he removed the farcical nature of U.S. policy regarding Israel, this pretend kind of policy, a policy that favors Israel in every circumstance, but claims to be even-handed in the Middle East. Now, no one can say that the U.S. is even-handed, and Israel and the United States stand alone. They were standing alone in Jerusalem this week during those ceremonies with Trump's daughter officiating. So the false face has been removed. Not that it fooled anybody, except possibly Americans. And we talk about U.S. support for Israel most often in terms of the Zionist influence in the United States. And of course, that's extremely important. The whole image of Israel as that shining city, as that struggling, heroic kind of nation was created in Hollywood, coterminous with the birth of that settler state. The movie Exodus, based on Leon Uris's book, was a huge hit put out by Hollywood, crafting an image of a beleaguered country that was surrounded by Arab enemies and a natural democratic ally of the United States, rather than an aggressor nation that was in the process of stealing land, a process that continues. And I think that support for Israel, besides the military, geopolitical importance of Israel to U.S. imperialism, is also rooted in its nature as a settler state, because the United States was a settler state and continues to have all the characteristics of a white settler state. And so the Israelis were seen as pioneers, the equivalent in Arab lands of Indian country, and making the desert bloom and saving or planting civilization in that part of the world. And it's very, very like, it perfectly matches the false narrative that many Americans, white Americans, like to think about their own country. That these vast uninhabited expanses were somehow tamed by European civilization, and that the Israelis are doing the same thing. So it's deeper than just Zionist influence in media and money. It's an ideology of white supremacy that has been developing for the 500 years since Christopher Columbus did his terrible voyage.
But it seems to me also that part of what we're looking at is how the theft of the Palestinian land, because that's what we're talking about. I mean, the invention of Israel was an assault on the people of Palestine and the Arab peoples in that region. And more than that, it was a major imperialist project that obviously, you know, supported by the same basic ideological foundation that you, as you mentioned, find here in the United States, you find with South Africa and other kinds of similar movements. I mean, that is real, but it seems to me like one of the roles that the Jewish state plays also is that it is something that has removed Africans and other colonized people as the central forces, the main forces in the world who have been oppressed and exploited by imperialism, and it has created this notion of white people being the most serious victims of brutality, terror, and even the word genocide was created to define what happened, you know, with Jews, what happened with these white people by other white people. And so, in fact, I have been in situations where public officials have been offended when Africans had the audacity to claim that genocide was some act against us was genocide. How can you say that given what has happened to the Jews? So it seems to me like, in terms of the ideological significance of it, that's one thing that it does too. It creates this whole notion that the worst crime in humanity was something that was created, committed against white people.
You know, this carefully crafted Holocaust narrative that so many people talk about is very difficult as the left has propagated to talk about in fear of the accusation of anti-Semitism. That being said, that old canard still holds for all of those coveted elected officials and organizations who receive money from that Israeli lobby and by extension their support organizations. So I think that needs to be said, and many people recognize. For a long time, the white anti-war movement has been pushed to talk about Israel's nuclear arsenal, their nuclear arsenal that is believed to be 200 warheads that they have stockpiled. And the 200 warheads may be legitimate because it was confirmed by Colin Powell in an email to a Democratic big shot. So the Nation published some time ago an article. One reason why Iran is afraid of Israel is because of its nuclear weapons. And we need to talk about that. They have not been part of any denuclearization program in the region. They are the only country, state in the region that has that capability. And just let me add, recently, I believe it was this week, MI5 released classified documents, and which these documents reveal that the biggest threat to England following World War II was from not the IRA, not any Muslim organizations, but the Stern Gang. And we all know about the bombing of the King David Hotel. A number of lives were lost. MI5 aborted an attempt for the Stern Gang to bomb a resettlement or a colonial center in Whitehall, which is in the center of London. They foiled that attempt. And we remember that the Stern Gang was founded and headed by Israel's first prime minister and a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, Menachem Begin. And so the contradictions abound in terms of how this successful allegation of anti-Semitism has stifled and prevented debate and any criticism, legitimate criticism of Israel excessiveness and their stockpile of nukes.
Yeah, we have to say that Israel is the premier terrorist nation in the world except for the United States. Israel has made no bones about carrying out continual, as a matter of Israeli policy since its inception as a state, constant assassination campaigns against folks that it deems to be enemies around the world. And it does not apologize for them. And it is not condemned by the United States, either officially through the U.S. government or by U.S. corporate media, who in fact treat Israel's assassination squads as if they are somehow virtuous and the kind of daring do that the United States ought to be carrying out. But I think that Israeli terror, besides the real kind with bombs and bullets and knives and poisons, is also of a political kind, because in the United States, folks are terrified to speak of what Nellie was just addressing, Israel's nuclear capacity, and the fact that as a country that does not even admit that it has nuclear weapons, it goes beyond just its failure to enter into the non-nuclear proliferation pact. If you have these weapons and you let it be known, in fact, that you have these weapons, and you won't even admit you have these weapons, you are telling the world, I am not bound by any constraints whatsoever, and I won't even promise not to use them. That is a threat to the world. But in the United States, a kind of political terror reigns, so that no one can run for Congress and think that they'll get elected and not be targeted if they even bring up the subject of Israeli nuclear weapons. No one can run for Congress who speaks the word apartheid in the same breath, in the same paragraph with Israel. Israel is the sacrosanct subject. And now that there is a global BDS movement to boycott and disinvest and sanction Israel for its crimes against humanity in states across the country and in Europe, it's becoming illegal to advocate a boycott of Israel. And large parts of our political vocabulary are about to be put off limits. Certain words cannot be associated with Israel, according to legislations that have been introduced and regulations that are in effect at some colleges, words that might tend to make people hate Israel. That becomes hate speech. So the struggle against Zionism and its murderous policies in the world and the barbarity of it as an ideology is also, as a matter of course, a struggle to broaden the spaces of speech in the United States and defend those democratic rights that we have left.
I want to.
Can I just add to that, Chairman?
Go ahead.
In 1986, Israeli scientist, nuclear scientist, and whistleblower Mordecai Van Nunu revealed to the world what was not a secret to begin with, and that is the country's nukes. He was jailed and sentenced to prison almost for 18 years. He's been released now. He's a Swedish citizen. So the secret is out. The secret has been verified by one of its own scientists, Mordecai Van Nunu. So there is no reason to doubt the obvious.
Let me, first of all, I want to let everybody know that this is the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. And I'm Omali Yeshitela, and the chair of that coalition. And we're talking now with Nellie Bailey and Glen, both of whom are co-founders of the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. And also, they are critical elements of the Black Agenda Report and radio. So this is the Black is Back Coalition. I want to just touch on something again, and hopefully not being too redundant, because I think this question of Israel is a critical question, one of the critical questions of our times, and obviously for the barbarism that it is committing against the people in Palestine, but it has done, as has been stated by both Nellie and Glen, other kinds of criminal acts against the people, against various people and peoples around the world. I think that the thing that is really distressing is something I mentioned earlier. First of all, it's illegal in most of Europe to disagree that there were 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust. You can't even debate that. If you say it, you can go to jail or you can be kicked out of the country. I know Africans who've been kicked out of France, for example, who question this whole notion about 6 million Jews being killed with the so-called Holocaust. And what's really striking about that is Belgium killed more than 10 million Africans right there in Congo alone. Right in Congo, and all the other millions of African people who have been killed everywhere, all around the world. The millions of Africans killed right here in the United States. But the worst crime in history has been committed against white people by white people. I think that's a real ideological problem. I think we have to smash through that, crush that. And I'm not talking about some of the silliness that we often hear from some people who, black nationalists who are competing carrying an old competition that used to occur in the African communities, you know, between petty merchants and what have you, and grew up as nationalist organizations during that time. I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm talking about the fact that Africans have been murdered and are being murdered every day, and the difficulty that people have in hearing us, and we have sometime in hearing ourselves, is this whole notion of the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews. I hear often Africans who, when they are complaining about something bad happening to us by the government, they say things like they're worse than Nazis, or, you know, that's like Hitler, etc., which is crazy. How can an African talk about Hitler? Hitler was a Boy Scout compared to what Churchill and Kit Carson and the heroes of Western genocide are recognized as. I think that's a critical question. This whole Holocaust, this lobby, they can't even say that you know, that it wasn't 6 million people. I mean, that's a matter of even debate, but you can't debate it. And that's problematic. You talk about an assault on free speech, and it's hardly debatable that at least 10 million Africans were killed in Congo alone by the Belgians. So I think that's really something that should be important to us. And I think that this whole Israel, the ideological significance of Israel is really important too. And like I said, you know, there was no such word as genocide until 1945, 48, sometime during that same time frame, you know, and a Polish Jew lobbied and what have you, and created the term genocide to speak to what was happening to those white people. And yet, you know, they've already slaughtered almost every indigenous person in the Americas. And they've killed, you know, peoples all around the world, Africans and everybody else. And now we look at the concept, and Lipsky, I think it was his name, and he was clear and stated it, that the definition of genocide did not apply to black people in the United States. Lipsky. He was clear on that. So I think that ideological aspect of it is really important too, and one that we have to deal with. And I think we have to expose the illegitimate state of Israel to the max. And there's one other aspect that I think may be important, is that I think that Israel can be at different instances a situation of the tail wagging the dog. That it is of such critical strategical significance to the United States government that it gets away with a lot of stuff. It's killed U.S. citizens. It's bombed U.S. troops. And someone mentioned they've murdered people in various other countries and been able to get away with it because they play a significant role in the Middle East, protecting the oil and the geopolitical terrain. It used to be said Western imperialism, but more what we're talking about is for U.S. imperialism. So what is it, though, that we have a situation now where the United States is moving, threatening, sanctioning Iran, just backed out of a nuclear deal that it had with Iran. And at the same time it does this, Netanyahu comes out and makes an extraordinarily bogus claim that Iranians breaking the agreement that they had made. What is going on?
Well, you know, I have no doubt that 6 million Jews died during World War II. Hitler led to the death of a lot of people. But 6 million Congolese have died since 1994 under Presidents Clinton and Bush and Obama, and the bloodshed continues under Donald Trump. And very few Americans are aware of that ongoing genocide, which is the biggest one since World War II. And this genocide in Congo we need to look at it even more closely, because it was the main actors in carrying it out were 2 U.S. client states, Uganda and Rwanda, who act as hitmen for the United States in Africa. But both of these countries also do the same job with Israel. Those are the two countries that are closest to Israel in Africa. So it's often very, very difficult to separate U.S. crimes from Israeli crimes. They are bound together strategically. They are bound together ideologically. And it is for that reason that those of us who consider ourselves people of the left should certainly not tolerate people calling themselves anti-imperialists who are also not against and vehemently against Israel and its depredations in the world.
What about? Go ahead.
Just let me add to that in terms of Israeli lawlessness. We remember they bombed the aspirin manufacturing company that was in southern Sudan, I believe. One can look at every international law that the Israelis have violated without any fear of consequences whatsoever. And just let me add two other caveats here. When Adler, the publisher of the Atlanta Constitution, called publicly for the assassination of President Barack Obama, and I believe he was calling on Mossad to carry out the deed. There was a 30-second outcry from the corporate media here. Adler apologized and later on resigned from the Atlantic Constitution. That's the big difference. Some of us remember Paul Finley. He was a former U.S. senator who wrote the book, They Dare to Speak Out. And the grip that the AIPAC lobby had on the American public and has on the U.S. Congress allows them to get away with literally everything. And we have to not only call that into question, but also the fact that the Jewish Holocaust is not the premier or the only Holocaust that has occurred in this country. I do believe 6 million Jews were killed. But the fact is they cannot monopolize that category of mass genocide. And we have to step up to the plate and call them on it.
Well, the Palestinians call what they underwent with the founding of the State of Israel the Nakba, which loosely translated is a catastrophe. Well, many peoples have suffered catastrophes at the hands of secular states. 1/5 of the world's population died in the 50 years after Columbus set foot in the Caribbean. That 1 out of every 5 human beings in the world died from that. That is the biggest Holocaust or Nakba in human history. And as you said, 10 million, just under one Belgian small European tyranny in Congo, 10 million in India after the rebellion of 1857, and on and on and on in their millions. There have been many catastrophes, many Nakbas, many genocides, and in the 500 years since Christopher Columbus sailed, they have all directly or indirectly been rooted in that European breakout of 1492. this expansionism, which gave us the world as we see it.
But I think it's also important to remember the unintended consequences of Israeli hegemonic military aggression. And there are consequences. It won't go down as they think it will when we look at Europe and to see whether or not it will stiffen its back in terms of its own economic loss as a result of the U.S. pulling out of the Iran deal. So I think there are unexplored consequences as a result of this catastrophe that Trump and the neo-Zionists in his administration has brought upon the world.
Certainly some consequences that we can foresee is the delegitimization of those Persian Arab regimes that are now doing everything they can to become de facto allies of Israel and the United States. They want to be allies of the United States, and you can't do that without being an ally of Israel, because those countries in foreign policy are twins. And that will undermine, continue the undermining of those governments among their own people.
I think that's right. I think that that's one of the things that we're going to see having great consequences. And also, it's in terms of the numbers of Jews killed during the Second Imperialist World War and the numbers of other peoples who have been killed historically by settler colonialism and what have you. One thing is sure, that if you lived in some places in the world, you couldn't disagree that 10 million people, Jews, died. They put you in jail or kick you out of the country. And I think that's one of the distinguishing things that we're talking about. You talk about terrorism and fear. You can't have another opinion. Perhaps you can't have another opinion in this country also.
Well, certainly the Congressional Black Caucus can't have another opinion. In 2014, when the Israelis were killing thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, a resolution of Congress passed unanimously affirming Israel's right to self-defense, to defend itself, as if that's what it was doing in Gaza. And every single member of the Congressional Black Caucus affirmed that resolution. And we know that that does not reflect the political opinion of black folks in this country.
Let's ask the question, though, about the legitimacy of the Israeli state itself.
Exactly. As a matter of political course, the Israeli government invites every politician, Democrat or Republican, to Israel. And invariably, especially if they're black, they will capture a picture of them with a rifle pointed toward Gaza.
I wonder if they get 12 virgins. I just think the whole question of the Israeli legitimacy. I mean, just think about this. I mean, one of the presidents of Israel was a white woman from Milwaukee, Golda Meir. And you got all these people from Russia and all these other places there, they come in and they take this land. And they talk about this flowering, wonderful democracy that's made the deserts bloom, but that's all of Europe. That's the whole European project pumped it up, supported it because it played a particular function in serving the interests of imperialism, of U.S. imperialism and Western imperialism in general. And that's what it does today. And
it's very simple, Chairman. Israel is the only state on the face of the globe that is based upon race. That race is the legitimizer of the state of Israel. It requires no more than that in the minds of its founders. And even American Jews who are not Orthodox find great difficulty becoming, and the difficulty is increasing, becoming citizens of Israel, because they're not recognized as being legitimately Jewish, not just by their profession of the religion, but they must prove that they are biologically Jewish as well. So it is a race-based state, and race-based states have gone extinct in this world, except for Israel. It is unique in that respect.
I would just add, it also helps with the $10 million a day that the U.S. sends to Israel.
Yes.
That's a lot of money.
Yes.
$10 million a day.
Yeah.
And that's not all of the aid when one considers the military aid to Israel. Although I do think in some of the more liberal, if one can say that, Israeli press, there is an internal discussion among intellectuals and religious leaders that Israel cannot exist as a Jewish state and a democratic state at the same time. It is in and of itself a contradiction.
So tell me this, don't you see a relationship between the existence of Israel and the ongoing struggle that's being made against specific countries like Iran, Syria, Libya, those forces that were characterized as the hard lines and where Israel was concerned? What are we looking at there? I mean, we're looking at this horrible, this war of genocide proportion that's happening in Syria. We saw what happened with Libya. We see what's happening in Iran, and it clearly, not just Iran, but we're looking at what's happening with the Houthi Yemen. All of these are instances of forces that either have a politic and a stance that recognizes Israel as hostile to the interests of the people there, and or aligned with Iran, that has been accumulating a capacity to speak to the interests of the people in that area.
Well, more broadly speaking, Israel has been a force for fascism all over the world. It's very, very active in propping up militarily, through intelligence, and politically every fascist-minded regime in the world, and of course in Africa. Now that they no longer have South Africa, they have many petty black dictators in Africa, with whom Israel has the closest military and political and intelligence collaboration. But there was a time when most of Latin America was ruled by military dictatorships, that Israel was the most active party, even more active than the CIA, in bolstering these military dictatorships, teaching them the techniques of torture, supplying them with the top-of-the-line state-of-the-art weapons of terror. Israel is the cutting edge of fascism in the world.
But we're looking at Israel and Netanyahu establishing relationships with Putin in Russia, with various other countries, and we don't hear the kind of denunciation that, I mean, it's mild denunciations. You know, what do they call it? How do you know, like force that's how do they term it? That it's not consistent with the threat or something like that. They there's terminology that they use for that, but I think it's mild. And inside the country, inside the United States, what is really interesting is Trumps and anti-Trumps alike. united with what's happening to the Palestinians. Trumps and anti-Trumps alike think it's great that the U.S. embassy is now in Jerusalem. All of the bourgeois media function as apologists for this aggression that's been made against the Palestinians, and also for sticking that embassy in Jerusalem.
Well, on the subject of Russia and how restrained, if that's a word, the proper word, Russia is regarding Israel, that's an internal problem that the Russians have. The oligarchs are a potent force in Russia, one that Putin has to deal with. And the oligarchs are heavily Zionist and have lots of investments in ties to Israel and to Israeli networks across the world. And the Russian mafia is heavily Jewish as well. And not that criminality has anything to do with the religion. I'm talking about the social and political and financial elements.
I'm not going to call you anti-Semite, Glenn.
President Benjamin Netanyahu marched with Putin in the Patriotic Day, celebrating the defeat of Nazism in Germany. He was there on full display, and it did signal to many this compromising position that Putin finds himself in, although by the same token, those oligarchs who have led the attack against Putin and have asserted themselves as potential leadership are also from the Jewish oligarch. I think that needs to be stated, because they are.
Well, we got an oligarch in 1600, what's it called? And in Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania Avenue. There's an oligarch that's pretty close to Russia as well for the time being. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted someone.
No, I had finished. I wanted to point out the fact that the most serious opposition to Vladimir Putin and the dictator narrative is also from Russian Jewish oligarchs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's right. They are a force to be recognized, reckoned with, and that power internally in Russia has a reflection in Russian foreign policy, although we have to say that it is Russia that stood up to the United States and therefore Israel in Syria, and drew a line, a line that said we will not tolerate any attempts to wipe out Syrian sovereignty and carve this nation up into little pieces.
But aren't people asking questions about Russia and its stance regarding the attack on Iranians? Was that and Russians themselves that was just made, and this was done by the Jewish state, claiming that this is really crazy, claiming that Hamas fired weapons from Golan Heights into Golan Heights, and therefore they were justified in firing hundreds of missiles to kill Iranians and possibly even Russians. Of course, Golan Heights, as everybody is aware, is Syria. Yes. So I think that the coalition has been pretty clear in terms of our opposition to what's happening to the Palestinians. But I think more than that, that we have a responsibility to push some of the questions that's just being raised here. I think exposing Israel is one thing that we really need to participate in doing. That's one of the reasons that we're doing this webinar right now. I think that, as I mentioned, even the founding documents of the coalition targeted the illegitimate state of Israel and offered support to the struggle of the Palestinian people, and that's righteous.
And in terms of the United States and Israel acting as a tag team internationally, they have done that also in terms of Durban 1 and Durban 2.
Yeah.
Those were the international UN-sponsored conferences on racism and racial discrimination, conferences that were building towards seeking reparations for countries that had been victimized by this 500-year process of European, Euro-American imperialism. And both of those conferences were sabotaged by a combination tag team of the United States and Israel under George Bush in 2001 and then under Barack Obama in 2009. So this policy of the United States working hand in glove with Israel to undermine any attempt to redress the grievances of Africans and other colonized people is a bipartisan affair. It's a Democratic and Republican affair. It's a U.S. policy affair.
Yeah. But speaking of U.S. policy, I think it's really worth noting that this naked, heavy-handed treatment of the Palestinians by Trump, something that even liberal apologists are saying, well, nothing else has worked in terms of bringing peace to the Middle East. Trump putting the embassy in Jerusalem, maybe that's going to be helpful. It's going to set new terms, reconfigure the debate, etc. Then on the other hand, we see them, and I know this was not on our agenda, but for discussion, but I just think it's meaningful that some of the same, and here we have it coming from people who were anti-Trump and as well as people who were pro-Trump, this question of Trump's threat against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and how they claim by many of them that the Kim Jong-un was ready to talk now and to talk peace because Trump scared him, and that the sanctions were hurting him. And I think that I don't think that we're looking at. I think we're looking at U.S. foreign policy expressing itself, in my view, by the way, because I unite with the assumption that there's going to be tremendous consequences of what's happening right now in the Middle East, because every one of those reactionary Arab leaders have to face the masses of Arab people, and for a long time they've been able to get away with doing certain kinds of stuff, and certainly the U.S. government, along with Israel, participating in murdering Yasser Arafat after everything else that they had done to force an election to put Abbas in place didn't have the consequences they want. They forced an election that Abbas lost to Hamas, and then all of the democratic leanings that they had went out the window. They starved Hamas to make them pay a horrible price for the people for having elected Hamas over Fatah. So we saw all of that, and I think that the people are now coming face to face, and will have to come face to face with these reactionary Arab leaders across the board, and I think that's going to turn out to be a very good thing, because the collaboration is almost open. The Saudis clearly a murderous, terrorist organization working hand in glove with Israel, the United States, the Jordan working hand in glove with Israel, the United States, and many of the other countries that are in that area are doing that. So there's going to be a price to pay, because the people do learn from their experiences, especially if they ever have the advantage of some kind of revolutionary leadership that helps to give direction. And I think that's something that we're going to see, because in the final analysis, the Palestinians are going to be the ones who play the critical role in resolving this contradiction. And I want us to be reminded, too, that the Palestinians are not just pitiful people, who suffering this stuff. But we've seen incredible organization for the the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, various other kinds of organizations, and of course, much of that has been smothered by Fatah, who has been directly on the payroll of the reactionary Arab regimes and who control the PLO that many of these other organizations participated in. But the fact is that the people do want to be free, and I think we're going to see that express itself in very definite kinds of ways, and more clearly now that these reactionary regimes are playing the role that they play. But what about Korea? Is it because Trump called Kim Jong-un Rocket Man and threatened to annihilate Korea? Is this why the meeting between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea, is that why it happened? Is that why they were talking peace? Is it really a success for the Trump regime that Kim agreed to talk to him? And what has happened now with Kim Jong-un saying that I don't think we need to do this with the U.S. and South Korea acting the way they're acting? What are we looking at?
Well, Kim has postponed the meeting or put in question the timing of the meeting with Trump, and he's suspended, which is a kind of postponement. I don't think he's going to carry through on the postponement with the South Korean leaders. Well, what the United States is doing right now is carrying out a military war games with the South Korean armed forces that involves B-52 bombers, the latest fighter planes, the whole panoply of weapons. And how can you expect to carry on good faith negotiations with someone and stand outside his house threatening him with weapons and burning him in effigy and carrying out all kinds of theater mimicking cutting his throat and hanging him and cutting up his body? That's the equivalent of what the U.S. Is doing right now. So how can a country that is self-respecting and demanding that it be respected and that its partners in negotiation comport themselves with some kind of civility and decorum tolerate a kill 'em, lynch 'em party right outside their doors?
Sister Nellie.
Yeah, I would totally agree. The utter brutality and disrespect for international law that the U.S. has shown, and I believe they have pressured the South Koreans to carry out these military maneuvers, which of course is a signal to North Korea, at least on my part. If you believe us, then you believe anything, because this is who we really are. And it is, I believe, as I heard someone say in our meeting, you comply or you die. And I think the decision of Kim Jong-un not to meet with Trump, with John Bolton using Iraq as an example of their policy and what they have accomplished, one would be almost insane to give up the only deterrent that they have from U.S. military aggression. I, for one, don't believe that the meeting with Trump as they have scheduled will proceed, and I believe that that the North Koreans are going to work with the South Koreans, and I do think in the background there is China who is involved in this, and I believe it is part of a large global strategic maneuver on the part of those countries that are in the crosshair of the U.S., particularly with China and the trade deal. and what they're going to do. I don't believe that these folks are operating in isolation. I think there are behind the scene alliances that perhaps we will never know about. But with John Bolton at the helm, to use Iraq
Libya
as an example of U.S. goodwill is really insanity.
Yeah.
But I think that's where they are.
So do you think that Kim
and all Koreans want unification, and this process the North Korean leader has initiated has brought those two Koreas closer in their mutual aspirations. And if in the end process, none of them, the North never meets with the U.S. president, that does not mean that the initiative is not successful.
Let me ask you a question, comrades. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question.
That the people in South Korea and in North Korea want a reunification.
Yes. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question. So, do you think the reason that Kim Jong-un agreed to meet with the South and to meet with Trump was because he was scared? That Trump scared him to the table?
No, I don't think so.
Do you think that his discussion
the
about
foreign policy can only look through their lens at other world leaders in terms of fear and how they have supposedly frightened them into compliance? I don't think he's afraid, and nor do I believe that the North Korean people are eating dirt, which is part of the insane propaganda in this country in corporate media.
They've been facing down the United States for 68 years. But, you know, Americans always think that everything is about them, and that if they cough, then the other side is supposed to be struck by terror. But the Asians are coming closer together in terms of the larger picture of Asia. And the United States becomes less and less relevant to the world scene. And the Koreans are seeing that. The U.S. Hyping up this military drill is designed to keep the South Korean military engaged here, because they are the parties that are most dependent and organically connected to the U.S. war machine. And so even the U.S. military exercises are designed to influence the South Koreans. And I think they're going to lose that push and pull, because they are the aliens.
My view, when I think about this, is that first of all, that the North has never refused to meet with the U.S. So to say that that somehow there's something magical has happened, something that they're now afraid and they will meet, they have never refused to meet with the U.S. And
in fact, they demanded to meet with the U.S.
Exactly.
The U.S. consistently says no.
Exactly, and that's the point. I want. Let me pull this point out, because part of what we're looking at too is the fact that there is a North and South Korea now because of U.S. intervention in Korea, as the people in Korea under the leadership of Kim Il-sung were crushing the Japanese colonialists who had occupied Korea all this time, and the U.S. intervened in that. And actually, you know, invaded, attacked Korea, supporting the quote-unquote fascists, if you will, but certainly the Japanese imperialists, and with the intent of going into China, which had just achieved independence as a quote-unquote communist country, and that the U.S. bombed the North so severely that it destroyed everything. In fact, the generals were complaining that they had nothing else to bomb. And, you know, you keep sending us out here, there's nothing to bomb. All the infrastructure, everything. And part of what they did, and then you're talking about the time you had Syngman Rhee, who was the puppet from the South that they put in charge, who literally participated in prisoners of war, having them their bodies pulled apart, literally limbs pulled off of them as a form of torture. This was their partner in Korea, and the only reason is that when the Chinese came across the border, as you know, and they prevented the U.S. from being successful. In the U.S., there was open discussion, even in media, about using atomic weapon in Korea and China. And the Chinese participated with them and stopped that. But their objective has been to deny the reality of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, not to dignify it by recognizing it, and pump up the other side, sending all kinds of resources, corporations, monies, etc., to show that it's better to be under white domination and capitalist than to be self-determining socialist communist country. And that was part of the whole ideological struggle that they were involved in as well. And which is why they were always refused the U.S. government to meet with the North, because in their view that legitimizes the North. So they've never wanted to do it. But what happens now is that suddenly Kim Jong-un has been shooting off those nuclear weapons and what have you, and then showing that he's got some kind of delivery capacity with those nuclear weapons, helping to force the South to take another look at this too, because when Trump talks about annihilating North Korea, he can't annihilate the North without annihilating the South. And Kim Jong-un is saying that we can do a little annihilating of our own. Japan has an interest in that. All of those countries now have an interest because the balance has been shifted in a very severe way. They don't have the kind of weapons that the U.S. has, but they got enough to cause a real problem. And I think that you're right. I think this desire by the North and the South to be reunited has been strong, always strong. I think that the South, because the South shocked the United States when they asked the North to participate in that Olympics thing. And when the Olympics thing happened, Kim's sister comes, and then you see all of the people, you can see the audience, the people crying. They're so happy to see the reunification or the apparent reunification of their country. And I think that something started happening, you know, between the Koreas, and that got out of hand. And this ongoing threat and I think that Kim Jong-un is in a better place. I mean, diplomatically, strategically, than Trump. Trump he ran around boasting, you know, I made him talk, and I'm the greatest, and et cetera, and that we're going to have this meeting, and he put everything out there like that and gave Kim the opportunity to say, well, I'm not sure about that. And now Trump is committed in a very serious way politically, and I think that he was outwitted. I think that you saw Kim Jong-un making all kinds of gracious moves and stuff like that, giving you prisoners, doing all this wonderful stuff, etc. Now, you know, and now you're doing this war games and what have you.
You know, there's something that almost no Americans know, but almost all Koreans know, and that is that when the U.S. occupied the southern half of Korea after World War II. First, it left in place the Japanese occupiers until it could muster enough of its own forces. The Japanese had colonized Korea, humiliated Korea since 1910, treated Koreans as an inferior race, and Koreans who live in Japan are still treated as inferior people. Japanese tried to destroy the Korean language and culture, made Koreans adopt Japanese names. Koreans hate Japan for righteous reasons. But Koreans also served in the Japanese colonial army and in the army that Japan fielded to invade Manchuria and to attack the rest of China. After the United States occupied the southern part of Korea, the U.S. Military put together a South Korean army whose officer corps was entirely made up of Koreans who had served in the Japanese colonial army. Korean traders, whereas on the northern side of the line, it was headed, the country was headed by people who had fought against the Japanese occupation. And so the patriotic nation, the patriotic state was the North, and the comprador state that made up of people who had collaborated first with the Japanese and now collaborate with the Americans. That's the South Korean regime.
Yes.
But that was almost 70 years ago, and most of those folks are dead now. And that's one of the reasons that South Korea is much riper in terms of receptivity among its population to reunification now than before, because those compradors, those traders, those quislings that the U.S. installed are now dying out.
And also because the U.S. is not the only one with a big stick.
That's
and
right.
I think that helps to alter, Uhuru,
And we can return to our theme of unintended consequences.
Yes.
Because the U.S. always turns the truth on its head. Trump comes out, he threatened to annihilate North Korea, which is impossible without the annihilation of those other countries on the Korean Peninsula. So right away, they know that they are dealing with mad men forces heading up the U.S. strategic foreign policy. So what did they do? I mean, remember, the Asian people have been at this for thousands of years, not like the little 500, 600 years in this country. These are masters at the game. These are the the imperial warriors and their war plans. So they outmaneuver Trump. And the appeal to South Korea, I believe, was pretty obvious. You want to die? Because if you don't, we better look at this Korean peninsula in a very, very different light.
Sure.
And let's see who our allies are, because we are dealing with unpredictable and dangerous forces. And John Bolton is just out of his mind, and anything that comes out of his mouth sounds in much greater, not fear, but in much greater concern what this government is capable of. And we cannot believe that North Korea isn't looking at what's happening in Palestine. They have a global view. So why in the world would any world leader trust the United States, particularly on denuclearization, when in fact everybody knows that Israel has nukes? Everybody knows that. These are heads of states. So the U.S. does not have any credibility whatsoever, and it remains to be seen what will the population do in Saudi Arabia. They are due for a revolution, a spring revolution, and I think the forces and the tides against U.S. imperialism and their hegemonic hold on the U.S. dollar as being the world or global currency, that is coming to an end, and that will no longer be the case.
Uhuru, I think that there's a whole different world underfoot here, and as opposed to looking at all of the strength and power, we're looking at an imperialism in disarray, and there's a lot more that I think we can say about that. I agree that they've unleashed forces that they have not intended to unleash. There's a certain kind of arrogance that's associated with this process that that makes them quite vulnerable. Africans a long time ago learned how to shuffle and grin in faces because that's what they required. It satisfies a deep set assumption of superiority and things like that could make them not see anything else. And I think that's I think Kim played them in that fashion, and we'll see where it goes henceforward. I agree that China is definitely a factor here. I know that much of the bluster that was made about Korea for a long period of time by Trump and by his predecessor was actually a threat to China, and that China had to control Korea. And China, of course, has gone through this process before and I don't think there's any way in hell that China could tolerate an invasion of Korea by U.S. imperialism or any other forces like that, because just in terms of its own sovereignty, its own security, I don't think China could live with that. And I do think it's been a factor and is a factor. And I know that they saw media reports that how these forces were so surprised because Kim Jong-un had made some unannounced trip to China during the height of this Chinese-U.S. discussions, and as things were heating up between the U.S. and Korea. And I do think that there is something happening there, and I think that the Korean people want something very deeply in terms of unification of their country, their people, and that's not going to be something that Trump or anybody else can sweep under the rug. The U.S. has attempted, again, not to meet with Korea. In fact, it had always, I forgot, I think there were about 6 or 7 of them that the U.S. always required to meet with Korea, so the U.S. couldn't be raising up Korea as some kind of legitimate force by meeting with them directly. And now they want to meet directly, and it's not because they've had some sudden change of mind about the nature of the Korean state, but I think there has been a clear demonstration by Kim Jong-un that's changed the balance there in terms of the development of the demonstrable development of a nuclear capacity, a demonstrable development of a delivery system for the nukes, and I think that changed things a hell of a lot. That shook up that entire region. Listening to Trump's bluster about killing and bombing people, and the Koreans demonstrated that they have a capacity to hit back. Now they can say we can meet. And now they can say we don't have to test nuclear. We don't have to test anymore. We know what we can do. We've got it. They've shown the world. We don't have to test. They can say, yeah, we agree not to test nukes anymore. We agree. We won't shoot missiles over Japan anymore. Right? Let's sit down and talk. Because they've demonstrated their capacity, and I think that gives them a hell of a weapon going into negotiations, but also not just with Trump, but within that entire region. So it's a different situation, and the U.S. is not prepared for it, as though it may think it's prepared for it. And Bolton, the statement that Bolton used is really interesting, because Kim Jong-un had previously said that they're not giving up anything because they saw what happened, what the U.S. did in Libya. And that's the example that Bolton used. He said explicitly, we're looking at the Libyan model. Explicitly. So, and also, as you know, the philosophy of the Kim Il-sung regime, Kim Il-sung is Jewish. And it, can be loosely translated as anti-flunkyism. That they're not going to be anybody's flunky. They're not going to be a flunky for China, for Russia, for the United States, anybody. And that's deeply embedded in the whole ideological foundation of that country. So that's part of what we've been watching.
Another example that North Korea has, aside from Libya and what happened to Gaddafi when he gave up the country's nukes, is also their broken promise, the lies to Iran. The U.S. was part of a global deal and now they're pulling out. So what does that say about its word? Even if you wanted to believe them out of desperation, one would be an absolute fool and to believe them, because their record indicates something very different than what it is that they promised.
Well, I think it's wonderful. We're looking at a whole totally reorganization of the forces in the world. I think it's a great period. It's obviously there's peril that's there, but it always is when you're talking about opportunity. I want to just remind everybody that this webinar is sponsored by the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations, and I'm Omali Yeshitela. I've been talking with Glen and Nellie, who are both co-founders of the coalition, and I want to see if there's anything that you comrades want to say to close it down. We want people to donate to the coalition. And I think that there's a way that you can do that. You can see it, so please do that. But is there anything, Nellie, Glen, that you want to say to close it down?
Yeah,
I think there is cause to be optimistic. And we can depend not only on the laws of unintended consequences, but the fact that the U.S. empire is in decline.
Indeed.
And these moves of desperation and threats is an indication of that slow but inevitable decline and destruction, self-destruction of this empire. And we can't separate what they're doing globally on their moves against people and the oppression of people on the domestic front. The two are tied, are intrinsically linked. And so I think there is room for great optimism. I think we have to speak truth to power. We have to be forthright and not allow the Black misleadership class or any misleadership class to steer us away from this in-depth criticism of the rogue state of Israel and its threat to world humanity.
I'd like for folks to look at the Korean situation from the Koreans' standpoint. China, with its One Road, One Belt initiative, which is multi-trillion, it's going to be the biggest investment and development project in the history of the world. It's going to fundamentally change the relationships among peoples, especially in Asia. So here we have South Korea, whose people, since the splitting of the country, do not have a border with China. They do not have a border with Russia. The northern part of the country has borders with China and with Russia, but the South does not. And in many ways, it has been like an island, a no-go area to its north and surrounded by water everywhere else, like an island. Certainly, the Koreans want to be part of that great adventure that's unfolding in Asia. They are part of Asia. They are not an island. And the Chinese are discussing possibilities for the One Road, One Belt initiative coming down from the north and connecting the south by land to the rest of Asia. And even the greediest of Kaibals, their equivalent of rich, corrupt white people, are interested in getting a part of that. So it is not the United States which is changing the lay of the land in Asia. Right. It's China that's doing that. and the Koreans are aware of it. They don't want to get left behind with Uncle Sam, who's on the way out.
Well, I want to thank everybody, and I want to remind everybody that the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is having our annual conference in August. Please, you can go to our website. There's some time in the history between now and August. It will be up, and it will be functioning properly. But I think that's August 11th and 12th, if that's the weekend. That our annual conference is going to be happening, and we want everybody to come out. I think it's a very important discussion that we've just held today. I don't know if you could have heard this discussion anyplace else. I agree with these comrades who talk about how intimidated so many people are to even talk about the illegitimate white nationalist settler state of Israel and the role that it plays all over the world, the role it plays here. We saw the damage they did to Cynthia McKinney, for example. I think this is really important, and in some ways the North Korea situation bears some similarities in the sense that it's not something that people would discuss up to now. The dictatorship in North Korea, irrational dictatorship is the kind of terms that they use to speak about the government of the Democratic Peoples of Korea. That the only thing they're interested in is saving the life of Kim Jong-un. He's just interested in his own security and no love or interest in the people. He's just this brutal dictatorship. You know the story. And I think it's really important for this discussion to happen. I think we have to try to make this discussion happen more and more, and play a very important role in educating masses of our people. One thing I can say about the comrades who I'm in this discussion with is that's always been impressive, is that for a long period of time they struggled for national liberation. Self-determination in the U.S. has been dominated by superstition and just supreme, profound philosophical idealism. And I think it's really important these comrades bring to the discussion, bring it down to earth. It is possible to give a real historical materialist analysis to what's happening in the world. It can be understood by human beings. You don't have to have a certain percentage of melanin to get it. Let's say we don't run around checking it. And it's just really quality discussion. I want to thank you both, Glen and Nellie, for sharing this with us, and want to remind people to support the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. And until our next time together, I want to thank everybody and say Black is back.
Black is back.
Black is back. All right.
Black is back.
Indeed.